Hello, everyone. Before we begin, comment below and let us know which city you're watching from. And stick around, because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. Imagine seeing someone from your past, the one person you thought you'd never cross paths with, again, only to find them in a situation so unthinkable it shakes you to your core. That's exactly what happened to Richard Collins, a ruthless businessman who built his empire from nothing. He had everything: money, power, success. But in one life-altering moment on the streets of New York, he saw her, the woman he had admired in silence for years, Madeline Harris, the girl he once dreamed of, the one who never even noticed him back then, now reduced to a homeless mother with 2 starving children by her side. Richard never considered himself a sentimental man. He made deals based on logic, not emotion. But as he looked into Madeline's eyes, hollowed by pain and time, something inside him shifted. He had spent his life chasing wealth, but standing in front of him was the harsh truth of what money could never buy. Why had fate brought them back together after all these years? What happened to Madeline that led her to this heartbreaking moment? And most importantly, was this Richard's chance to finally do something that truly mattered? This is a story of redemption, sacrifice, and a love that refused to die. But what Richard does next will leave you in disbelief. The cold wind swept down the streets of Manhattan, sending loose papers flying across the sidewalk. Richard Collins pulled the lapels of his tailored coat closer to his neck, barely noticing the cold. He was a man of discipline, of unwavering focus. His time was valuable, and he never wasted it, except for that day. That day, fate had other plans. As he crossed the street near Madison Avenue, his sharp eyes caught sight of a figure hunched on the sidewalk. Something about her posture, the way she shielded the 2 children beside her, made him slow down. It was rare for anything to make Richard hesitate. But this was different. The woman, dressed in torn and oversized clothes, had her arms wrapped protectively around 2 little girls who looked no older than 4. One was rubbing her eyes with tiny, dirt-streaked hands, sobbing softly. The other clung to her mother's side, her blue eyes wide with fear. The sight alone was heartbreaking, but it wasn't until the woman lifted her head that Richard felt the breath leave his body. Madeline. Even under the layers of exhaustion and pain, he recognized her immediately. The girl who had once ruled the halls of their high school, whose laughter had been the brightest sound in any room. She had been untouchable, popular, the kind of girl who could make or break someone's social status with just a glance. And Richard. Richard had been the quiet kid in the back of the class, the one who admired her from a distance, knowing he was invisible to her. Yet now, the woman before him was nothing like the Madeline he had known. Her once shiny chestnut hair was tangled, her green eyes dull and sunken. She was thinner than he remembered, too thin. Her lips trembled, whether from cold or hunger, he wasn't sure. Madeline? His voice came out more hesitant than he intended. The woman flinched at the sound of her name, her arms instinctively pulling the children closer. She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto his. For a moment recognition flashed across her face, quickly followed by shame. She looked away. "Please, just go," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Richard took a step forward, his chest tightening. "What happened to you?" "It doesn't matter," she muttered, refusing to meet his eyes. But it did matter. It mattered because no one, especially not Madeline Harris, should be sitting on a freezing sidewalk, begging for help. One of the little girls whimpered, and Madeline immediately shifted her attention to her daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking her hair. "Mommy's here." The tenderness in her voice, the desperation in her touch, struck something deep in Richard's chest. He didn't know what had happened to her, But one thing was clear: she needed help. And for the first time in his life, Richard Collins didn't think about business, about deals, or about personal gain. He thought about the girl who had once been so full of life, now reduced to this. Without another word, he pulled out his phone and called his driver. "Be here in 5 minutes," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Then he turned back to Madeline. "You're coming with me." She immediately shook her head. "Number, I can't—" "I wasn't asking," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You and your daughters are not spending another second on this street." Madeline sat in silence for a long time, staring at the flames as if searching for the right words. Richard didn't rush her. He simply watched, waiting. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "After high school, I thought I had my life figured out," she began. "I got a scholarship to study business at Columbia. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I was determined to make something of myself." Richard leaned forward slightly, listening intently. He had no idea she had gone to Columbia. He had gone to NYU, but back then, their lives had already drifted too far apart for him to know where she had ended up. She sighed, rubbing her hands together. "That's when I met Daniel." The name made something inside Richard tighten. He already knew where this was going. "We met in one of my business classes. He was charming, confident, everything I thought I wanted in a man. We started dating, and at first, everything was perfect. He made me feel special, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. But looking back now, I realize he never saw me, only what he could take from me." Richard's jaw clenched. He didn't interrupt, but his fingers tightened around the armrest of the chair. "I got pregnant with the twins in my junior year," she continued, her voice unsteady. "When I told Daniel, I expected him to be shocked, but I never expected him to just leave. He didn't even pretend to care. Just told me he wasn't ready to be a father and that I needed to figure it out on my own." Richard exhaled slowly, trying to keep his temper in check. He had seen men like Daniel before, selfish, entitled, unwilling to take responsibility for their own actions. It made his blood boil. Madeline let out a hollow laugh. "I was stupid. I thought maybe if I gave him some time, he'd come around. But he never did. And then everything started falling apart. I lost my scholarship because I couldn't keep up with classes while working 2 jobs and taking care of newborn twins. My landlord gave me a month's notice, and after that, I had nowhere to go." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I tried, Richard. I really did. I worked every job I could find, waitressing, cleaning, anything that would put food on the table. But no one wants to hire a single mother with 2 babies. Childcare was too expensive. I was stuck." Richard's fingers tightened into a fist. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The girl who had once been the queen of their high school, the girl who had always seemed to have everything, had been abandoned, left to struggle alone. "What about your family?" he asked carefully. Madeline shook her head. "My mom passed away a few years ago. My dad, he wasn't in the picture. I didn't have anyone." She sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. "One day, I just couldn't pay rent anymore. The landlord kicked us out, and after that, I had to make do with whatever shelters would take us. When those were full, I slept in subway stations, parks, anywhere that was safe enough for the girls." Her voice broke on the last word, and for the first time since she started speaking, tears welled up in her eyes. Richard sat in stunned silence. He had built his life around logic and reason, around cold, calculated decisions that always led to success. But there was nothing logical about what had happened to Madeline. No reason that could justify it. She had done everything right, and still, the world had crushed her. He exhaled sharply, leaning forward. "You're not alone anymore, Madeline. You and the girls will never have to live like that again." She gave him a tired, skeptical look. Why are you doing this, Richard? Because I still care about you. Because I've spent my life chasing things that don't matter, while the one thing I actually wanted slipped away before I even had the chance to hold on to it. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he just met her gaze and said, "Because I can." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face as if trying to find the catch. But there wasn't one. Mrs. Walker, the housekeeper, walked in just then, clearing her throat. "Sir, the little ones are settled in. I gave them some warm milk, and they're fast asleep." Madeline's posture relaxed slightly, and for the first time since they had arrived, she looked relieved. "Thank you," she said softly. Mrs. Walker gave her a kind smile. "They're wonderful little girls." Then she turned to Richard. "Would you like me to set up a guest room for Miss Harris?" Richard nodded. "Yes, make sure it's comfortable." Madeline stiffened. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he interrupted firmly. "You and your daughters will stay here until we figure out something more permanent." She hesitated but eventually nodded. The exhaustion in her eyes was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Walker led Madeline upstairs, and Richard remained seated by the fire, staring into the flames. His mind was racing. He had spent his life making deals, solving problems, eliminating risks. But for the first time he was facing something he couldn't control. Because Madeline wasn't just a problem to fix. She was a woman who had suffered, who had fought to survive, and who still carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. And the worst part? Richard knew he had never stopped caring about her. As he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept repeating in his mind. "I won't let her go through this alone, not anymore." The morning sunlight filtered through the grand windows of Richard's estate, casting a warm glow across the room where Madeline and the twins slept. For the first time in months, maybe years, Madeline had slept soundly, her body finally able to rest without the constant worry of where they would go next, or what they would eat the following day. She stirred awake to the soft laughter of her daughters. Blinking against the light, she turned her head to see Harper and Hazel sitting on the floor, playing with a set of stuffed animals that she was sure weren't there the night before. "Where did those come from?" she asked groggily, sitting up. Hazel giggled, hugging a plush bunny to her chest. "The nice lady brought them." Before Madeline could question further, a soft knock at the door drew her attention. Mrs. Walker peeked in with a warm smile. "Good morning, Miss Harris. I brought some things for the girls, just a few toys and some clean clothes." Madeline's heart clenched at the unexpected kindness. She had spent so long being treated like an inconvenience that simple gestures like this felt foreign. "That's really thoughtful of you." "Thank you," Mrs. Walker smiled kindly. "Breakfast is ready whenever you're up to it. Mr. Bennett is already downstairs." Madeline hesitated. The idea of sitting down to breakfast in a mansion with Richard still felt surreal, but she wasn't about to let pride get in the way of feeding her children. After helping the girls get dressed in the fresh clothes, soft, clean, and far nicer than anything they had owned in years, she led them downstairs. The dining room was something out of a dream. A long mahogany table stretched across the space, adorned with crystal chandeliers and silverware that likely cost more than she had ever made in her entire life. Richard sat at the head of the table, a cup of coffee in his hand as he scrolled through his tablet. At the sound of their footsteps, he looked up. His expression softened when he saw the girls, who clung to their mother's hands. "Good morning," he greeted. "Good morning," she replied, her voice unsure. Harper and Hazel, however, were far less hesitant. The scent of fresh pastries and pancakes immediately caught their attention. "Mommy, look!" Harper gasped, pointing to a plate stacked with waffles, whipped cream, and berries. Richard smirked, setting his tablet down. "I wasn't sure what they liked, so I told the chef to make a little of everything." Madeline swallowed. She wasn't used to generosity without a hidden motive. "This is too much." Richard shook his head. "No, it's not." Seeing the hesitant look on her face, he gestured toward the table. Please sit, eat. You don't have to worry about anything right now. Despite the strange tension that still lingered between them, she obeyed. The moment the girls sat down, they dug into their food, their faces lighting up with delight. Madeline, however, took her time, still feeling out of place. Richard watched her carefully. "Did you sleep well?" She hesitated before nodding. "Better than I have in a long time." "Good." He sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. "We need to talk, Madeline, about what happens next." She tensed. "Next?" "Yes." He leaned forward slightly. "You and the girls can't go back to the streets. That's not an option." She stiffened at the implication. "I wasn't planning on it." "Then what was your plan?" Richard asked, his voice steady but firm. "You had nowhere to go last night, no job, no home. What were you going to do?" Madeline clenched her jaw. She hated feeling cornered, but she couldn't deny the truth. She had no plan. Richard sighed. "I want to help you, Madeline. Not just with food and shelter, but with something real. A fresh start." Madeline stared at him, unsure how to respond. "You've already done so much. I don't know how I could ever repay you." "I'm not asking for repayment," Richard said simply. "I just want to give you a chance to get back on your feet." She hesitated, uncertainty clouding her expression. The idea of accepting his help was terrifying. She had spent so long surviving on her own, relying on no one. Trusting Richard meant allowing herself to be vulnerable again, and that scared her more than anything. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. Richard held her gaze. "You don't have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. After breakfast, Richard led her to a quiet sitting room, where a stack of papers sat neatly on a coffee table. "What is this?" she asked, eyeing the documents. He sat down across from her, folding his hands together. "A few options. I've been making some calls this morning, and I found a few job opportunities that might be a good fit for you." Madeline blinked. "You did this for me?" Richard shrugged. "You're smart, Madeline. You don't belong on the streets. You just need a chance." She hesitated before picking up one of the documents. It was a position as an administrative assistant at one of Richard's subsidiary companies. Her hands trembled slightly. "I don't have experience in an office like this," Richard smirked. "You managed to raise 2 kids while fighting to survive every day. I think you can handle a desk job." She let out a small laugh, probably the first genuine one in a long time. But still, doubt gnawed at her. "Why are you doing all this, Richard?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze unreadable. "Because I can," he finally said, echoing his words from the night before. "And because I think you deserve more than the hand life has dealt you." Madeline looked down at the papers in her hands, her mind spinning. She'd spent years believing she was alone, that no one cared, that she had to fight every battle on her own. And now, sitting across from the boy she once ignored, the boy who had grown into a man willing to help her without asking for anything in return, she realized something terrifying. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone after all. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and cautious hope. Madeline still struggled to accept the kindness Richard offered, but with each passing moment, it became harder to deny that he was genuine in his intentions. He wasn't just offering a temporary handout. He was offering her a real chance to rebuild her life. After much thought, she accepted the job he had arranged for her. It was an entry-level position in one of his company's offices, a simple administrative role. But for Madeline, it felt like the first step toward something she never thought possible: stability. On the morning of her first day, she woke before the sun, her nerves on edge. She dressed in the professional clothes Richard had provided for her, still feeling strange in them, as if she were pretending to be someone she wasn't. She smoothed the fabric of her blazer with shaking hands, glancing at her reflection in the mirror. Could she really do this? The sound of little feet pattering on the floor snapped her out of her thoughts. Hazel and Harper appeared in the doorway, rubbing their sleepy eyes. "Mommy, where are you going?" Harper asked, her voice thick with sleep. Madeline bent down and cupped her daughter's cheek. "Mommy got a job, sweetheart. I'm gonna work today." Hazel frowned. "You're leaving?" "Just for a little while," she reassured them. "I'll be back before you know it." Before she could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. Richard stood there, dressed in his usual tailored suit, looking completely at ease. "Are you ready?" Madeline swallowed hard and nodded. She gave the twins one last kiss before following him downstairs, where his driver was already waiting. The drive to the office was quiet, tension filling the space between them. Richard noticed her tightly clasped hands resting on her lap. "You don't have to be nervous," he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. She let out a shaky breath. "I haven't worked in years, Richard. What if I mess this up?" He glanced at her, his expression steady. "Then you'll learn and get better. No one expects perfection on the first day." Madeline appreciated his reassurance, but her stomach remained in knots. When they arrived at the building, she was overwhelmed by the sheer size of it. The office tower stretched high into the sky, a symbol of wealth and power. Two things she had never been close to. Inside, the sleek, modern design of the lobby made her feel out of place, but Richard walked beside her as if she belonged there. "This is where you'll be working," he explained, leading her to the reception desk. A woman in her 40s, with a kind smile, greeted them. "Madeline, this is Laura, the office manager. She'll help you get settled." Madeline shook Laura's hand, trying to hide her nerves. "It's nice to meet you." "Welcome aboard, Madeline," Laura said warmly. "Let's get you started." Richard gave Madeline an encouraging nod before stepping back. "I'll check in later," he told her before walking away, leaving her to take her first step on her own. The hours passed in a blur. Laura showed Madeline around, introduced her to the staff, and explained her responsibilities. At first, she felt completely lost, fumbling with the unfamiliar computer programs and struggling to keep up with instructions. But Laura was patient, and by the afternoon, Madeline was starting to find her rhythm. During lunch, she sat at a small break room table alone, sipping a cup of coffee. It felt strange, being in a normal workplace, surrounded by people who had no idea where she had come from or what she had been through. Then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. "How's it going?" Madeline smiled slightly and typed back, "Still standing." A reply came almost immediately. "I knew you would be." A warmth spread through her chest, something she didn't quite understand yet. That evening, Richard was waiting for her outside the building. He leaned casually against the car, hands in his pockets. "How was it?" he asked as she approached. She let out a breath. "Not terrible." "That's high praise," he smirked. "Come on, let's get home." As they drove back, Madeline stared out the window, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Just days ago, she and her daughters had been sleeping on the cold streets. Now, she had a job, a roof over their heads, and for the first time in years, something that felt dangerously close to hope. But deep down, a fear lingered. This couldn't last forever. Could it? Later that night, after putting the twins to bed, she found herself standing in the doorway of Richard's study. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see her there. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She hesitated before stepping inside. I wanted to say thank you for everything." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't have to thank me, Madeline." "Yes, I do," she insisted. "No one else ever helped me. No one even looked at me twice when I needed it the most. But you," she swallowed. "Why are you doing all this?" He was silent for a moment before finally speaking. Because I can. She frowned slightly. That's not an answer. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. I used to think money could fix everything, that if I had enough, I'd never feel empty. But the more I made, the more I realized how little it actually meant. He met her gaze. Then I saw you, and for the first time in a long time, something felt real. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what she had expected him to say, but it wasn't that. She looked away, her fingers twisting together. I don't know if I can ever repay you, Richard. He shook his head. I don't want repayment. I just want to see you and the girl safe. Happy. Madeline nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Good night, Richard. Good night, Madeline. As she walked back to her room, she realized something terrifying. She was starting to trust him, and that scared her more than anything. The days turned into weeks, and for the first time in years, Madeline felt a sense of routine in her life. Each morning, she woke up in a warm bed, got dressed in the professional clothes Richard had provided, kissed her daughters goodbye, and went to work. The office job, once intimidating, had become something she looked forward to. She was learning quickly, growing more confident with each passing day. Harper and Hazel thrived as well. With regular meals, a stable environment, and a sense of security they had never known before, they blossomed into happy, energetic children. Their laughter filled the mansion, making it feel less like a grand, intimidating estate and more like a home. Richard, as always, remained a steady presence. He was there to check in on her progress at work, to ask about the twins, and to make sure she was never overwhelmed. He had become someone she could rely on, something she never thought she would have again. But despite everything, a nagging fear still lingered in the back of her mind. Could this really last? One evening, after putting the twins to bed, she sat on the balcony overlooking the garden. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the cool breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Richard approaching until he spoke. Penny for your thoughts? Madeline turned to see him leaning against the doorway, his hands in his pockets. She hesitated before answering. I just keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for all of this to be taken away. Richard sighed and stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Why do you think that? Because nothing good ever lasts, she admitted, looking down at her hands. Because every time I've thought things were getting better, something came along to ruin it. Richard was silent for a moment before sitting beside her. Madeline, I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that you don't have to go through it alone. You're not the same person who was struggling on the streets. You've built something here, a life, and you deserve it. She swallowed hard, his words striking something deep inside her. I just don't want to be a burden to you, she whispered. Richard exhaled sharply. You think you're a burden? He shook his head. Madeline, you and the girls have brought something into my life I didn't even realize was missing. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? I've spent years chasing success, making money, building an empire, he said, looking out over the garden. But none of it ever felt real. It was just empty. And then I met you. He turned to her, his gaze intense. You reminded me what really matters. Madeline's heart pounded. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Richard had become more than just the man who saved her. He had become someone she cared about, someone she trusted, and that terrified her. She stood abruptly. I should get some sleep. Richard studied her, sensing the hesitation in her voice, but he didn't push. Of course. Good night, Madeline. She nodded and walked away, her heart racing the entire time. The following week, something unexpected happened. Madeline was in the office, typing up a report, when Laura, her manager, approached with a wide smile. "Madeline, can I speak with you for a moment?" Madeline nodded, following her to a quieter area. "You've been doing an incredible job," Laura said, "and Richard has been singing your praises. We'd like to offer you a full-time position with a promotion, if you're interested." Madeline's mouth fell open. "A promotion?" Laura chuckled. "Yes, you've proven yourself. And this would mean better pay, more stability." For a long moment, Madeline didn't know what to say. This was everything she had been working toward. A real job. A real future. Finally, she found her voice. I'd love to accept," Laura grinned. "Congratulations." When Madeline got home that night, she found Richard in his study. He looked up when she walked in. "You're home late," he noted. She took a deep breath. "I got a promotion." His eyes lit up. "Madeline, that's incredible." She nodded, still in disbelief. "I never thought I'd get here." Richard stood and walked toward her. "You got here because of your own strength and determination. I just gave you a push." She looked at him, something shifting between them. The gratitude she felt for him ran deeper than words, but there was something else, too. Something she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She took a step closer. "Richard, Before she could finish, he reached up and gently cupped her face. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. And then, before she could think twice, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was soft at first, hesitant. But as Richard pulled her closer, she melted into it, all the fear and uncertainty fading away. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Madeline, I know," she whispered. "Me too." The months that followed were the happiest of her life. She excelled in her job, the twins continued to flourish, and her relationship with Richard deepened. They were no longer just two people brought together by circumstance. They were a family. One evening, Richard took her and the girls out to dinner at an elegant restaurant. After dessert was served, he cleared his throat and reached into his pocket. "Madeline," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "I never expected my life to change the way it did when I met you. But now, I can't imagine it without you." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a stunning engagement ring. Harper and Hazel gasped in delight. "Mommy, say yes," Harper whispered excitedly. Madeline covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Richard smiled. "Will you marry me?" For the first time in years, she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she breathed. The restaurant erupted in applause, but all she could focus on was the man in front of her. The man who had saved her, yes, but who had also loved her when she thought she was unlovable. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, she realized something. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. And that's a wrap on today's story. Madeline's journey reminds us that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always hope. Sometimes, kindness from one person can change a life forever. What did you think of Madeline and Richard's story? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales of love, resilience, and second chances. Until next time, stay inspired and keep believing in the power of change.